Charlie and John were the last ones to the mall. When they pulled up, the others were gathered tight in a circle in front of Marla's car, as if sharing a conspiracy. "Come on," Marla said before they had walked all the way into the group. She was bouncing on the balls of her feet as if she were ready to run for the door of the abandoned building. Everyone but Charlie and John had changed their clothing, wearing jeans and t-shirts, things more suited for exploration, and she had a brief moment of feeling out of place. At least I didn't wear a dress, Charlie thought. "Let's go," she said. Marla's impatience seemed to be contagious, or maybe it just gave Charlie an excuse to let her real feelings come to the surface. She wanted to show Freddy's off to the others. "Hold up," John said. He looked at Jessica. "Did you explain everything?" "I told them about the night guard," she said. "What else is there?" He looked thoughtful for a moment. "I guess nothing," he said. "I brought more lights," Carlton said, and held up 3 flashlights of varying sizes. He tossed one to Jason, a small one with an elastic headband attached. Jason turned it on, fixed it around his head, and began moving enthusiastically in waves and circles, making the light bob and dance. "Shh," Charlie said, even though he wasn't making any sound. "Jason," Marla whispered, "turn it off. We can't attract attention, remember?" Jason gleefully ignored them, spinning off into the parking lot like a top. "I told him if he's not good, he has to wait in the car," Marla told Charlie quietly. "But now that we're here, I'm not sure which place is creepier." She eyed the bare branches overhead, raging in the wind, threatening to reach down and grab them. "Or we can feed him to Foxy," Charlie winked. She went to her trunk and hefted out the police flashlight, but she didn't turn it on. Instead, Carlton switched on 2 of his smaller lights and handed one to Jessica. They headed into the mall, knowing where they were going and what was waiting for them there. Charlie, John, Jessica, and Carlton moved through the empty spaces with a sense of purpose, but the others kept stopping to look around. "Come on," Jessica said impatiently as Lamar gazed up at the atrium dome. "You can see the moon," he said and pointed. Next to him, Marla nodded, mimicking his posture. "It's beautiful," she said, although she couldn't see it. From a distance, they heard footsteps echo in the emptiness. Hey, over here!" John hissed, and they hurried as quietly as they could. They couldn't run for fear of making noise, and so they walked, fast but careful, hugging the walls. They entered the black void of the department store, creeping along in the shadows until they reached the break-in in the wall. John held back the hanging plastic, obscuring the opening as the others maneuvered around the scaffolding. Jason was slow, and Charlie put a hand on his shoulder to hurry him up. As she steered him into the opening, a strong beam of light swept into the room, scanning up and down the walls. They all ducked through the plastic and ran down the alley to where the others were crouched down against the wall. "He saw us!" Jason whispered, alarmed, running straight to his sister. "Shh," Marla said. They waited. Charlie was next to John this time, and after that moment by the tree, whatever it was, she was almost uncomfortably aware of him. They were not quite touching, but she seemed to know exactly where he was, an awkward sixth sense. She glanced at him, but his eyes were fixed on the opening on the hallway. They could hear the guard's footsteps now, clear in the empty space, each one distinct. He was moving slowly, deliberately. Charlie closed her eyes, listening. She could tell where she was from the sound. She could tell where he was from the sound. She thought, getting closer, then farther, crisscrossing the open room like he was hunting for something. The steps came right up to the entrance of the alley and stopped. They all held their breath. "He knows," Charlie thought. But the steps started again, and she opened her eyes and saw the light receding. He was going away. They waited, still motionless, until they could no longer hear the tapping of his hard-soled shoes. She and John both stumbled a little as they stood, and she realized they'd been leaning against each other without realizing it. She didn't look at him. Instead, she set to work taking the heaviest things off the wood shelf. "Will I be needing this?" Lamar asked, as Charlie handed him a bucket with a saw sticking out of it. "We have to move the shelf," Jessica said. "Come on." Jessica, Charlie, Carlton, and John got back into place and moved the shelf. Lamar tried to find a place to help, but there wasn't really room. Marla just waited. "I'm better suited to supervising," she said when Charlie mock glared at her. This time the screaming of the metal door was not as loud, as if it no longer protested their entrance quite so strongly. Still, Marla and Jason covered their ears. "You think that's not going to bring the guard?" Marla hissed. Charlie shrugged. "Didn't last time." "I know he saw us," Jason said again. The others ignored him. "His flashlight went over me," he insisted. "It's really okay, Jason," Jessica said. "We thought he saw us last night too, but it was fine." Jason looked dubious, and Lamar bent over to his eye level. Hey, Jason, he said. What do you think the guard would do if he saw us? Shoot us? Jason whimpered, eyeing Lamar warily. Worse, Lamar said gravely. Community service? Jason wasn't sure what it meant, but he held his eyes open wide as though it was something terrible. Will you leave him alone? Marla whispered, amused. He didn't see us, Jason reassured himself, though clearly unconvinced. Charlie turned on the big light and shone it down the hallway. Oh my, Marla gasped, as the first light streaked across the interior of the pizzeria. Suddenly it became real and her face flushed with awe and fear. They went in one by one. The temperature seemed to drop as soon as they walked into the hall, and Charlie shivered, but she didn't feel ill at ease. She knew where they were now, and she knew what they would find. When they got to the dining room, Carlton spread his arms wide and twirled. Welcome to Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, he said in a booming announcer's voice. Jessica giggled, but the melodrama did not actually seem out of place. Marla and Lamar gaped at the room, awestruck. Charlie set the large flashlight on the ground, the beam facing up, and it lit up the main room in a dim and ghostly illumination. Cool, Jason said. His eyes fell on the merry-go-round and he raced for it, and jumped onto the back of a pony before anyone could stop him. He was too big for it, his sneakers dangling all the way to the ground. Charlie smiled. How do I make it go? He shouted. Sorry, buddy, John said. Jason climbed off, disappointed. The arcade's over this way, Carlton said, motioning to anyone who might follow. Marla went with him, while Jason fiddled hopefully with the carousel's control box. Lamar had walked to the stage and was standing transfixed, staring up at the animals. Charlie went over to him. I can't believe they're still here, he said as she walked up. Yeah, she said. I'd forgotten this was a real place. Lamar smiled, for the first time resembling the little boy Charlie had once known. Charlie smiled back. There was something surreal about the place. She had certainly never told any of her school friends about it. She wouldn't have known where to begin. Worse, she wouldn't have known where to stop. Jessica poked her head out from the retracted curtain at the side of the main stage, and they both startled. What are you doing? Lamar asked. Exploring, she said. There's nothing back here but a bunch of wires, though. She disappeared into the folds of cloth again. After a moment, they heard a thud as she jumped to the ground and came strolling over. Do they work? Lamar asked, pointing to the animals. I don't know, Charlie said. Truthfully, she had no idea how they worked. They'd always just been, set to intermittent life by whatever alchemy your father performed in his workshop. It doesn't look like anything is missing. They should work, she reluctantly added, though in her head she questioned the idea of trying to turn them on. Hey, Jessica exclaimed. She was kneeling by the stairs to the stage. Everybody come here, now! Charlie went over and Lamar followed. What is it? Charlie asked. Look, Jessica said, shining her little light. Though well hidden along the grain of the wood, there was a door inset into the wall of the stage. How did we not see that? Charlie wondered. We weren't looking, John said, staring intently at the small door. The whole group had gathered, and now Jessica looked around at them with a grin, put her hand on the little doorknob, and pulled. Magically, it opened. The door revealed a small, sunken room. Jessica shone the light around it. It was full of equipment. One wall was covered in TV screens. Must be CCTV, Lamar said. Come on. Jessica handed her flashlight to Charlie and swung her legs through the door. There was one deep step leading down into the room, which was no bigger than a large refrigerator turned on its side. That's a little too cramped for me. I'll keep looking around out here, John saluted, then turned as though to stand guard. This is like a clown car, Marla remarked as she jostled against Charlie. The space was too cramped for all of them, but they crowded together. Jason sat on the step, feeling more comfortable by the exit. There were 8 television screens across the wall, each with its own little panel of buttons and knobs, and sticking out beneath them was a panel, almost a table, covered in buttons. They were large and black, unlabeled, and spaced in an irregular series. The other wall was blank except for a single large switch by the door. What's this do? Jason said, and put his hand on the switch. He hesitated just long enough for someone to stop him, then pulled on it. The lights came on. What? Carlton looked to the others frantically. They all stared at one another in confused silence. Jason climbed up and poked his head out of the main room. They're on out here, too. Some of them, at least, he said too loudly. Why is there power? Jessica whispered, reaching over Jason to pull the door closed again. How is that possible? Charlie said. This place hasn't been open in 10 years. Cool. Marla leaned forward, studying the monitors, as though expecting some sort of answer to be revealed. Turn on the TVs, Jason said suddenly. I can't reach. Jessica flipped on the first TV and static crackled across the screen. Nothing? Charlie asked impatiently. Just a sec. She twisted a dial, wiggling it back and forth until an image emerged. It was the stage, centered on Bonnie. The other animals weren't visible. Jessica turned on the rest of the TVs, adjusting them until the pictures became clear, although most were still poorly lit. They still work, Charlie said, almost under her breath. Maybe, Jessica said. Hey, someone go out there, see if the camera's live. Okay, Marla said after a brief hesitation, wriggling her way to the exit and awkwardly climbing over Jason. A moment later, she appeared on camera, on stage beside Bonnie. Marla waved. She appeared multicolored in the stage lights as they bathed her in purple, green, and yellow from different sides. Can you see me? She asked. Yeah, Carlton shouted. Lamar was staring at the buttons. What did these do? He said with a wicked grin, pressing one. Marla screamed. Marla, are you okay? Charlie shouted. What happened? Marla was standing still on the stage, but she had backed away from Bonnie and was staring at him as if he might bite. He moved! Marla yelled. Bonnie moved. What did you do? Marla! Jessica yelled, laughing. It's okay. We pushed a button. Lamar pressed the button again, and they all watched the screen this time. Sure enough, Bonnie turned stiffly to one side. He pressed it again, and the rabbit swiveled back to face the absent audience again. Try another one, Carlton said. Go ahead, Lamar said, and climbed out of the little room to join Marla on stage. He crouched down to inspect Bonnie's feet. They're attached to a swiveling panel, he called. Yeah, Jessica called back, not really listening. Carlton started pressing buttons as the rest of them watched the cameras. After a moment, Charlie left the room as well. It's too stuffy in here, she explained. Jessica's perfume and Carlton's hair gel, both of which smelled nice enough out in the open, were starting to form a sickly miasma. She stepped out into the open to watch them experiment with the animals on stage. Most of the dining room was still dark. There were 3 colored spotlights suspended from the ceiling, aiming beams of purple, yellow, and green at the stage. The animals were cast now in unnatural colors, and dust in the beams of light shone like tiny stars, so many that it was difficult to see through them. The floor beneath the long tables was dusted with glitter that had fallen from the party hats, and as she looked around, she noticed again the drawings that lined the walls of the place, all at the height of children's eyes. They had always been there, and Charlie wondered now where her father had gotten the first ones when the restaurant opened. Had he used her own childish scribblings, or had he made them himself and stuck them up there, forgeries to encourage actual children to display their art? The thought of her father hunched over his workbench, gripping an unsteady crayon with hands accustomed to manipulating microchips, made her want to giggle. She noticed the flashlight still on in the center of the room and went to switch it off. Don't waste the battery, she said in her head, in chorus with Aunt Jen's voice. She turned her attention to the stage. It looked like the others had gotten Chica and Bonnie to go through a series of small, specific movements. They could each swivel their entire bodies back and forth, and their hands, feet, and heads could be moved in various directions, but each movement was separate. Charlie went back to the control room and stuck her head in. Can you make them do the dance? She asked. I don't know how, Carlton said, leaning back away from the monitors. All of this must have been used to program the dances. I don't think someone was in here manually controlling everything during the shows. He shook his head with certainty. That would have been impossible. Huh, Charlie said. Everyone quiet, Marla called out, and they all fell silent. For a long moment there was no sound. Sorry, guys. There we go. For a long moment there was no sound. Then Lamar said, What? Marla frowned, tilting her head to the side, listening for something. I thought I heard something, she said finally. It was like pings of a music box. Her mouth barely moved as she spoke. It's gone. Why isn't Freddy moving? Charlie asked. I don't know, Carlton said. I can't find the controls for him. Jessica said, tapping the monitors. These cameras don't show the whole place. Charlie peered at them, but they were mixed up, in no logical order. She couldn't piece together a picture of the whole restaurant. There's 3 cameras on the stage, one on each animal, but there should be one on the whole thing, Jessica was saying. There's the entrance to the kitchen, but not the kitchen itself, and you can't see the hallway in the room with the little light we were on where we were at last night. With the little stage we were at last night. Maybe the cameras are just in the main room? Carlton suggested. Nope, said Jessica. There are cameras everywhere out there. So, Carlton said. So there's got to be another control room, Jessica said triumphantly. Maybe down the hall by the other stage. Charlie went back out into the main room again. She was feeling restless, less excited by the discoveries than the others, though she wasn't sure why. She watched the stage. Carlton was still playing with the buttons. Bonnie and Chica jerking in small, disjointed motions as Freddy Fazbear remained motionless, his eyes half closed and his mouth slightly open. Hey, Lamar said suddenly. Marla, the music. I hear it now. Everyone was silent again. Then Marla shook her head. Creepy, she said. More excited this time, though, rubbing her hands together as though they were sharing campfire stories. Lamar looked thoughtfully at Freddy. Let's go find the other control room, Jessica said, emerging with a determined look on her face. Okay, Marla jumped from the stage to join them, and they started scanning the rest of the stage, looking for a second door. I'm staying in here, Jason called from the first room. This is so cool! Chica swiveled back and forth rapidly on the stage as he pushed her button repeatedly. Lamar went to join Jason. Okay, my turn, he said, leaning on the door. He went in, not waiting for Jason's response. Charlie stayed where she was, still staring at Freddy, frozen in the middle of his act. John came up next to her, and she felt a flash of irritation. She didn't want to be cajoled into joining the search. He stood there for a moment, looking at Freddy, then leaned in close to her and whispered, I'm counting to 100. You better hide. Surprised out of her thoughts, she looked at him for a moment, her irritation broken. He winked at her, then covered his eyes. It was absurd, it was childish, and in that moment it was the only thing she wanted to do. Slightly giddy, Charlie took off, looking for a place to hide. Jason pushed the series of buttons again with increasing frustration. I'm bored now, he announced. How can you be bored? Lamar said, wide-eyed. They aren't working anymore. Jason continued to press the buttons, no longer watching the monitors. Lamar studied the monitor. Bonnie's head was up and turned to the side, his eyes appearing to watch the camera. Well, go find your sister then, he told Jason. I don't need your permission to be bored. Impatiently, Jason climbed up and out of the control room. Everyone's so sensitive, Lamar muttered, suddenly realizing he was alone in the control room. He climbed out, but Jason was already gone. Jessica was leading the exploration party headed toward the little stage they had discovered the night before. Marla looked back and saw Jason skipping to catch up just before they disappeared into the long hall. Hey, be careful, she called over her shoulder as Jason branched off in his own direction. Lamar caught up to the group and followed them on their way into the hall. The main dining room was empty now, though Jason could hear Charlie's and John's playful shouts echoing from the party rooms that extended off the main building. Left alone, Jason headed straight for the arcade. It was more dimly lit than the rest of the place, and without power, the arcade machines appeared as towering black monoliths in a forgotten graveyard. The air was stale and thin. Jason went to the nearest console and pressed a few buttons. Some stuck with age, but nothing happened. Plug it in, duh. He ducked behind the games to check. But even though the mounds of wires seemed impossibly tangled, it looked like they were plugged in. Maybe there's a switch for the whole room? He started checking the walls. There was no obvious switch, but as Jason scanned the walls, he became distracted by the children's drawings taped in clusters. Jason was too young to have any memories of his own from being at Freddy's. Even Hurricane itself was no more than a hazy set of impressions. But something about the pictures brought up a sense of nostalgia. They were all the same, really, the kind of drawings he and every other kid had done. Figures with circles for bodies and sticks for arms and a multitude of colors. Only a few details showed which figures were the animals. Chica with her beak, Bonnie with his ears. It seemed like there had been a bit more attention paid to the drawings of Freddy Fazbear. They were a little better. The children had been a little more careful to make the details right. Jason found himself looking at one drawing in particular. It was the same as the others, maybe a little better. Bonnie the bunny hugging a child. There was no name at the bottom. Jason took the picture off the wall, uncertain why this one in particular interested him so much. John burst into the room with a wide grin and a deep breath, but then, seeing that it was only Jason inside, he quickly returned to his stoic demeanor. What's up? He nodded his head, playing it cool, then casually stepped away before silently returning to his sprint. Playing hide-and-seek like babies, Jason thought. I hope I never fall in love. He looked back down at the drawing and squinted as though not seeing correctly. The child was now facing away from Bonnie. Jason stared for a long moment. Wasn't he hugging Bonnie before? He looked out of the main room, but Marla was out of sight, looking for the control room. Jason folded the drawing carefully and put it in his pocket. It was suddenly apparent how quiet it had become outside. Jason stepped up timidly and peeked into the dining room. "Guys," he whispered, looking back once, then ventured out to find the group. Jessica, Lamar, Carlton, and Marla were still creeping slowly through the other half of the building. The spotlights from the dining room didn't reach this far, only accenting edges and corners or specks of glitter. Jessica scanned the wall with her flashlight, looking for breaks in the plaster, and motioned to Marla to do the same. "We have to check for a hidden door," she said. "The last one wasn't really hidden," Carlton pointed out. "Yeah," Jessica conceded, but she kept her light on the wall, clearly not ready to give up with the hunt. They passed 2 bathrooms they had not noticed the night before. "Do you think the plumbing still works?" Carlton said. "I really need to pee." "What are you, 5 years old? I don't want to hear that." Jessica rolled her eyes and walked faster. When they got to the room with the little stage, everyone stopped. Marla and Lamar went closer to the stage, drawing together slightly as if unaware they were doing it. Even though Carlton and Jessica had been here the night before, it was as though they were seeing it anew through Marla's and Lamar's eyes. They still hadn't seen what was behind the curtain, Carlton realized suddenly. "I remember these posters," Lamar said. "I remember this, too," Marla said, pointing to the sign that read, "Out of Order," strung across the stage. "My whole life I've felt uneasy when I've seen that phrase, even if it's just at a vending machine." She laughed insincerely. "I know what you mean," Lamar said softly. Before he could go on, Carlton interrupted. "Found it!" "Maybe," Jessica amended. There was a door closed set into the wall like the one below the stage, not quite hidden, but not meant to be noticed. It was painted black like the walls of the room. Jessica turned the knob and pulled, but it was stuck tight. "Locked?" Lamar said. "I don't think so." "Let me try," Marla said. She grabbed the knob and yanked, and it came open, sending her stumbling back. "Impressive," Lamar said. "Yeah, well, taking care of Jason makes me tough." Marla grinned as she knelt down to squeeze through the small door. It was almost the same as the first room, a set of 8 TV screens and a large panel of unmarked black buttons. Carlton fumbled to find the master switch, reaching his hand into a dark corner. Then with a click, the power came on, and a soft buzzing sound filled the room. Rich, bizarre reds and blues began streaming in under the door from the stage lights outside. Jessica and Carlton began switching the televisions on. They fiddled with the knobs until they were showing pictures, though most were very dark. From here, they could see a long shot of the main stage, just as in the other room, but the rest of the cameras were showing other places and angles. While the first control room had only shots of the main dining room, here they could see other areas of the restaurant, the private party rooms, which were set up with glittery decorations for events that would never happen, hallways, an office, and even what looked like a storage closet. The room behind them was visible as well. The camera trained on the Out of Order sign, now lit with otherworldly shades, and the curtain behind it. On one screen, they could see Jason ducking back into the arcade. "Maybe I should go get him," Marla said, but no one responded. Marla started pressing buttons. Spotlights appeared and vanished on the stage, in the main stage dining room, as he did, illuminating first one animal and then another, lighting up empty spaces where someone might once have stood. He flipped a switch, and it seemed for a moment that nothing happened. Then Lamar started laughing, pointing at one of the screens. The pizza decorations lining the walls were spinning wildly as though they might leap off and go rolling away. "I forgot they used to do that," Lamar said as Carlton brought them slowly to a halt. There was a large black dial to one side of the buttons, and Carlton spun it, but it seemed to do nothing. "Let me try," Lamar said. He elbowed Carlton to the side and pressed another button. There was a high-pitched whine. They all jumped, and it quickly faded down to a static hum. Lamar pressed the button again, and the sound was gone. "I guess we know what turns the speakers on," Carlton said. "I bet we could figure out how to play the music," Jessica said. She reached forward and pushed something else, and stage lights popped up while the main lights dimmed. The figures on the main stage suddenly stood out a little, commanding attention. She pushed it again, and the lights faded back to normal. "I love that," Carlton said. "What?" said Marla. "Stage lights," he said. "One switch, it's like a whole other world up there." Another button flickered the lights on and off, and in the room behind them, while another started and stopped the little merry-go-round, its tinkling noise grinding to grinding too slowly, like the ride itself was trying to remember how the song went. They managed to get the speakers on again, without the feedback whine, but there was still only static. I have an idea, Jessica said, pushing to the front of the group. She switched off the static again, then started turning the knob back and forth. The hum grew lower in pitch, then higher, responding to her adjustments. Progress, Carlton said. It's still just static, Marla said, unimpressed. Jessica turned it lower again, then snatched her hand from the dial like she'd been bitten and punched the button, shutting the speakers off. What? Marla asked. Jessica remained motionless, her hand still suspended in the air. What happened? What happened? Did it shock you? Carlton asked. It sounded like a voice, Jessica answered. What did it say? Marla asked, apparently interested again. I don't know. Let me try again. She turned the speaker on, calling forth the static, and lowered the hum as they all listened, intent on the sound. As it sank to a lower register, just below the range of human voice, they all heard it, grinding in broken words, almost too slow and distorted to be considered speech. They looked at one another. What on earth? Marla said. No, it's just random static, Lamar said. He reached for the controls, dialed the pitch back up slowly. For another fleeting moment, there was a purposeful sound. That sounded like singing, Carlton said. No, Lamar said, sounding more unsure this time. Do it again, Marla said. Lamar did this, but by this time the static was empty. Is that Charlie? Marla suddenly became focused on a blurry figure moving down the hall toward them, sliding along the wall as though to remain unnoticed. Charlie was hurrying, almost skipping, and trying to find another place to hide. She glanced behind her, vaguely suspecting that John might be cheating. She moved through the darkness and toward the colorful glow of the small stage curtain, which was throwing eerie reds and blues onto the tables and party hats. Going through the passage had always felt like a long and perilous journey, one not to be made alone, but she kept her gaze fixed behind her, letting the walls beside her guide her step. She knew John was close, probably creeping up on her in the dark. Suddenly she backed into something, stopping short. She'd been moving faster than she thought, or more likely, the hall was not as long as she remembered. She saw his shadow at the end of the hall. If he turned his head, he would see her. Without thinking, Charlie climbed up onto the platform she'd bumped into and ducked behind the curtain, tucking herself between the wall, a large bulky prop, trying not to breathe. Charlie, he called, still far away. Charlie! Charlie felt her heartbeat quicken. There had been boys she liked now and then, but this was something different. She wanted him to find her, but not quite yet. As she waited, her eyes adjusted to the darkness, and she was able to make out the shape of the curtain at the edge of the stage. She looked up at the object in front of her. No! Her body shuddered, then froze. It was standing over her. It was the thing from her father's workshop, the misshapen thing that hung in the corner, shaken by random convulsions as its eyes burned silver. Does it hurt? Now it was still, and its eyes were blank and dull. It was staring straight ahead, insensate, and its arm, with its hook, hung useless at its side. She recognized his eyes, but he was somehow worse now, encased in hollow body parts and matted with red fur and a stench of glue and oil. He had a name now. They called him Foxy, but she knew better. Charlie shrank away, pressing against the wall. Her heart was racing, and her breath was shallow, too fast. Her arm had been touching its leg, and now she felt a sudden itchiness from it, like she'd been contaminated. She wiped her hand violently against her shirt, and she began to panic. Run! She sprang away from it, pushing off the wall to get away, to move before it saw her, but the edge of the stage caught her foot. She stumbled forward, momentarily, becoming entangled in the curtain. She struggled to get free when suddenly the thing's arm jerked up, and the hook slashed at her arm. She ducked away too late, and it caught her. The pain was shocking, like freezing water. She tripped backwards and found herself falling for long cords, and then she was caught. Charlie, are you okay? It was John. He had caught her. She tried to nod, but she was shaking. She looked at her arm. There was a cut above the elbow, almost 4 inches long, bleeding profusely. She covered it up with her hand, the gaps between her fingers welling over as her own blood leaked through. "What happened?" Marla asked, rushing up behind her. "Charlie, I'm so sorry. I must have hit a button that caused it to move. Are you okay?" Charlie nodded, a little less shaky. "I'm fine," she said. "It's not that bad." She moved her arm around experimentally. "See, no nerve damage," she said. "I'll be fine." Carlton, Jessica, and Lamar came hurrying out of the control room, sorry. "We should take her to the ER," Carlton said. "I'm fine," Charlie insisted. She stood up, refusing John's help, and braced herself on the stage for a moment. She heard her Aunt Jen's voice in her head. "How much blood have you lost? You don't need to go to a hospital. She could move her arm just fine, and she would not bleed to death from this." She felt dizzy, though. "Charlie, you look like a ghost," John said. "We need to get you out of here." "Okay," she said. Her thoughts were scattered, and the injury hurt less than it should have. She took deep breaths as they headed for the exit, grounding herself. John handed her a piece of cloth, and she put it to the cut to slow the bleeding. "Thanks," she said, looking at him. Something was missing. "Was that your tie?" she said, and he shrugged. "Do I look like a tie person?" She grinned. "I thought it looked good on you." "Jason!" Marla yelled as they passed the arcade. "Move it or I'm leaving you behind!" Jason ran to catch up. "Is Charlie okay?" he said anxiously. Marla caught her breath and put her arm around him. "She's fine," she reassured him. They walked briskly down the same corridor they entered through. Jason looked back as he was being guided out, studying the pictures on the wall once more before losing sight of them. The colored lights from the stage were fading, and the flashlight was throwing shapes and shadows on everything, making the drawings difficult to see. But Jason could swear he saw the figures moving in the pictures. They all hurried back through the empty building and out to the parking lot, not keeping watch for the guard. When they made it out to the car, Lamar, who had grabbed the big flashlight, flipped it on and shone it at Charlie's arm. She looked down at the cut. "Do you need stitches?" Marla asked. "I'm so sorry, Charlie." "We were all being careless. It's not your fault," Charlie said. She knew she sounded annoyed, but she didn't mean to. Her voice was tight and clipped with pain. The shock had worn off, but that meant the wound had begun to hurt. "It's fine," Charlie said, and after a long moment, the others gave in, somewhat reluctantly. "We should at least get some stuff to clean that up and bandage it," Marla said, wanting to do something to atone, however small. "There's a 24-hour drugstore just off the main road," Carlton offered. "Charlie, why don't you go with Marla, and I'll drive your car back to the motel," Jessica said. "I'm fine," Charlie protested half-heartedly, but she handed Jessica the keys. "You're a good driver, right?" Jessica rolled her eyes. "People from New York know how to drive, Charlie." John lingered a moment as Charlie was getting into Marla's car. She smiled at him. "I'm fine," she said. "I'll see you tomorrow." He looked at her like there was something more he wanted to say, but he just nodded and left. "Okay," Marla said. "To the drugstore." Charlie twisted in her seat to look at Jason. "Did you have fun?" she asked. "The games don't work," he said, obviously preoccupied. The drugstore was only a few minutes away. "You stay in the car," Marla commanded to Jason as they pulled to a stop. "Don't leave me out here," Jason pleaded. "I told you to stay," she repeated, a little confused by the fear in his voice. He didn't answer, and she and Charlie headed inside. As soon as they were gone, Jason pulled a drawing out of his pocket. He held it up under the faint lights of the parking lot to examine. It hadn't changed back. Bonnie the bunny was reaching toward a child who was facing away from him. Curious, Jason scraped at the crayon lines with his fingernail. The wax came off easily, leaving its trace on the paper. As soon as Marla passed into the fluorescent-lit, air-controlled drugstore, she sighed and put her hands to her temples. "Oh, he's such a little brat," she said. "I like him," Charlie said honestly. She was still using John's tie to staunch the bleeding, and now in brighter light she peeled it back to see the cut. The bleeding had almost stopped. It was not as... "How come you brought Jason anyway?" Marla didn't answer right away, setting her sights on the first aid aisle and heading for it. "Here we are," she said. "What do you think? Gauze?" "Sure, but don't call me Gauze." Charlie leaned into Marla, but was ignored. "Antiseptic," Marla continued, grabbing the items. "The thing is," she said, "so Jason's dad and our mom have been married since before he was born. I mean, obviously. And they're probably getting divorced. I know about it, but Jason doesn't." "Oh, no," Charlie said. "They're fighting all the time," Marla went on, "and it scares him, you know. I mean, My dad left when I was still a little kid, so I grew up with that. I was used to it. Plus, I got to have a great stepdad, but for him, it's gonna feel like the end of the world. And they're sure not doing anything to make it easier. They're fighting right in front of us. So I didn't want to leave him alone with that for a week. I'm so sorry, Marla, Charlie said. Yeah, it's okay, Marla said. I'm leaving in a year anyway. I'm just worried about the brat out there. He's really not a brat, Charlie said, and Marla grinned. I know. He's pretty great, right? I kind of like having him around. They paid for the supplies. The clerk, a teenage boy, didn't bat an eye at Charlie's moderately blood-spattered appearance. Outside, they sat on the hood of the car. Marla started to open the bottle of antiseptic, but Charlie held out a hand for it. I can do it myself, she said. Marla looked like she was about to argue, but she swallowed whatever she was about to say and handed Charlie the bottle and a piece of gauze. As Charlie awkwardly cleaned her arm, Marla smiled impishly. Speaking of people we like having around, are you having fun with John? Ow, that stings! And I don't know what you mean, Charlie said primly, suddenly putting all her attention on her task. You do too. He's following you around like a little puppy, and you are loving it. Charlie bit back a smile. How about you and Lamar? She retorted. Me and who now? Marla said. Here. She held out a hand for the bloody gauze, and Charlie handed it to her, reaching for a clean strip. You're going to have to let me tape it, Marla said. Charlie nodded and held the gauze in place as Marla reached for the tape. Come on, Charlie went on. I see the way you look at him. Nope, Marla smoothed down the last piece of tape and put everything back in its bag. Seriously, Charlie said as they got back into the car. You're adorable together, and your names are anagrams of each other. Marla and Lamar. It's meant to be. Both laughing, they headed back to the motel.
You got me running in a circle. I'm just trying to find my way back to you. What happened to us? Round in a circle. Back where I started, I'm stuck in like glue. You keep me on a loop. I'm just trying to find my way back to you. What happened to us? Round in a circle. Back where I started, I'm stuck in like glue. You keep me on loop.